Now, in Gaza, the UN Human Rights Office says it is appalled by more than a week of heavy Israeli strikes in the territory's north. It says it has received reports that Israeli forces have fired at people trying to evacuate. In a statement, the office said the Israeli military appears to be cutting off North Gaza completely from the rest of the Gaza Strip and conducting hostilities with absolute disregard for the lives and security of Palestinian civilians. And we are joined now by Ajith Sunghay, who is the head of the UN Human Rights Office for the occupied Palestinian territory. He's based in Amman, Jordan. Welcome to DW. Thank you so much for joining us today. The UN Human Rights Office says the Israeli military, as we just said, appears to be cutting off North Gaza completely from the rest of the Strip. Can you tell us specifically what you're seeing there?
Well, thanks for having me. That's a very important point that you raise. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks is an extremely challenging, manner of getting to the north, especially for the humanitarian entities who are supplying desperately needed humanitarian aid to people living in the north of Gaza. We still believe there are about 350 to 400,000 people in Gaza, and we have been unable to access these people in the last 2 weeks. And there have been many failed attempts by the UN to get to the north to take these life-saving necessities. After repeatedly trying, we've been turned back, been refused access, so on and so forth. Finally, yesterday, we had some success, and I would say this is not sufficient by any means for some food trucks to enter north. And that's why we believe that the north is being cut off from rest of Gaza.
Israeli officials, however, say that evacuation orders are aimed at specifically separating Hamas fighters from civilians. They're denying that there's any systematic plan to clear civilians out of Jabalia or other northern areas. What is your reaction to that?
Well, the question is, where do they go? Where do civilians go? There are a couple of things here. Number one, civilians from the north refuse to go to the middle Gaza or to southern Gaza, mainly because they believe there is no safe place in Gaza. And we have seen this for the last 1 year, that people who have believed that south is safe or middle Gaza is safe, including the so-called humanitarian zone in Al-Mawasi, have been struck by the Israeli Defense Force, and people have died. So they don't believe that moving from north makes sense for them. That's number one. And number two, they're also very worried that once they leave Jabalia or other parts, it'll be impossible for them to return. There are no guarantees that they'll be able to go back. So that's a major, major concern for them. In terms of armed groups, we've always said this. Armed groups, too, are under an international obligation to make sure that they abide by international humanitarian law, and we don't let them go scot-free either.
Could I ask you to describe to us the conditions for people who are staying in Jabalia?
Look, it's terrible. On the whole, first of all, we have to remember the entire Gaza Strip is an extremely desperate situation in the south, in the north, as well as in middle Gaza. In the north, it becomes even more precarious because, like I mentioned, access for humanitarian aid workers are very difficult, if not impossible. So what we see is people in rubble with whatever structures that are present, sheltering in many makeshift IDP camps, which are also struck by the Israeli Defense Forces. And in desperate sort of lack of food and clothing and food situation.
It's been about a year since Israel launched its full-scale operation in Gaza, of course, in response to the October the 7th Hamas attacks. As the head of the UN Human Rights Office in the Palestinian territory, is your fear that the plight of the civilians there may be forgotten as this conflict intensifies, as it expands into Lebanon?
That is definitely our fear, and that's something we have very clearly expressed. And I thank you for bringing that up. We should not take our eyes off of what's happening in Gaza. A lot of that's happening around the area is also the root causes go back to the situation in Gaza. There are tens of thousands of civilians who are struggling and suffering on a daily basis, women and children included. Not to forget that majority of those who've been killed and injured in this war on Gaza has been in women and children. And we cannot forget that the international community, as it is, has struggled to put an end or even a humanitarian pause for that, for that matter, in Gaza. What we need is a desperate ceasefire, and that's urgent. And if we take the eyes off Gaza, I think people will be forgotten, and I think the suffering will be at an astronomical level.
Ajith Sunghay, head of the UN Human Rights Office for the occupied Palestinian territory. Thank you so much for your time today. We do appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Michael Lynk is the UN Human Rights Office's former special rapporteur for in human rights in the Palestinian territory and Professor Emeritus of Law at Western University in Canada. He joins us now from London, Ontario. Welcome to DW News. Now, the report from the UN Human Rights Office accuses Israel of trying to cut off northern Gaza from the rest of the Strip. Help us understand the gravity of that statement in light of international law.
Well, there are two big issues, I think, that are being raised by the United Nations Human Rights Office with respect to northern Gaza. One is the apparent use of starvation by Israel as a means of trying to force the 400,000 Palestinian civilians to flee northern Gaza. Starvation, obviously, is the use of starvation by a military is a war crime, and it may well be an aspect of genocide as well. And the second issue has to do with forced transfer of civilian populations, unless absolutely needed and necessary by military operations, is forbidden by international law. And the aim of what Israel is doing, according to this recently published outline of the so-called Israeli General's Plan, would be to empty northern Gaza, allow the Israeli military free hand in the northern part of Gaza, and then there'd be a question whether or not any of those Palestinians would be allowed to return.
The Israelis say they're trying to separate Hamas fighters from civilians. How would you assess that?
Israel has been saying that, I guess, since the start of this war, and we've seen obviously how poorly Israel has been being able to distinguish combatants from civilians. Israel has regularly justified its strikes in dense residential areas or in schools or on hospitals by stating that it is detected Hamas fighters or Hamas command center. And when civilians are killed as a result of these attacks, Israel has promised that it's going to investigate. We've rarely ever seen justification or proof that it's Hamas fighters who were there at the time when the strikes occurred, where civilians are huddled. And we've rarely ever seen the results of Israeli military investigations into the death or injuries caused to Palestinian civilians. And as we well know, it appears that the vast majority of the 42,000 plus Palestinians who've been killed since October 7th of last year are civilians.
How does the Human Rights Office gather evidence in Gaza right now?
Sure. What it relies upon are both the Palestinian and international humanitarian organizations that are on the ground. It also collects it from other UN agencies who are on the ground, such as UNRWA, the UN Palestinian Agency for Refugees, or the World Health Organization as examples. It will gather the constant evidence that it receives from these organizations, assess it, and then make its evaluations. And the UN generally has been pretty reliable, both in terms of the facts that are reported and its assessment of comparing these facts to what legal standards are governing both Hamas and Israel.
Okay, Michael Lynk, we'll have to leave it there. Many thanks for speaking to us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, amidst the latest fighting in Gaza, the World Health Organization has started the second phase of its polio vaccination program for hundreds of thousands of children. Protecting young lives from the disease has become a priority after the first case in a quarter century was detected in Gaza earlier this year. But WHO officials say their goal of reaching at least 90% of children in Gaza could be compromised, considering Israel's escalating operations in parts of the territory.
Children have their fingers marked after they receive a second dose of the polio vaccine. The programme aims to immunise over 500,000 children under the age of 10. After the first round was successfully administered last month. Polio was detected in Gaza in July for the first time in 25 years. It left a 10-month-old baby partially paralysed.
Vaccination is very important, especially in these days where many diseases are spreading.
2 doses of the vaccine are needed to halt transmission, and at least 90% of children need to be immunised. The first round reached an estimated 95%, but the WHO says a substantial constraint to the campaign will be reaching those in areas where there are no humanitarian pauses in the fighting.
There's so many evacuation orders and forced displacement orders underway, tens of thousands of people being forced to move again and again. They're just exhausted. They're absolutely exhausted. And what we cannot do is provide polio vaccinations to children that are either fleeing enforced displacements or fleeing from bombs falling from the sky.
800 people have been mobilised to raise awareness about the importance of the vaccine, along with utilising all digital communications. Children are also being simultaneously co-administered with vitamin A in a bid to help boost their immunity amid poor sanitary conditions.
Well, Deepmala Mahla is Chief Humanitarian Officer at the NGO CARE, which has been working in Gaza. She joins us from Nairobi. Welcome to DW. And we just heard there in the report, Gaza's remaining hospitals, they're all under threat of attack, which is preventing patients and supplies from getting through. Are those dangerous conditions affecting CARE's work in Gaza as well?
The conditions are beyond dangerous, and as humanitarians, as CARE, we are short of words to describe what it is like to operate in Gaza. It's been over a year. We have been repeating these messages, bringing you the misery, the unimaginable conditions in which people are living with. Hospitals, schools. And is this the first time we have heard about a hospital or a school being attacked? The answer is sadly no. And since October, 2 weeks, no aid at all has been able to go to northern Gaza. And we are talking of a population, people living in northern Gaza. Several of them are already very close to starvation. They are under trauma. They are unlivable conditions. And today, 14th October, the second round of the polio vaccination campaign was supposed to begin. It began, but the school which has been attacked, that school was also supposed to be a site of vaccination, which it cannot be. But I wonder, what relief are we providing to people with these vaccinations? Are we just delaying the pain or possibly death to these children? Because we have been calling for a ceasefire for over a year,
right,
but we continue to see preventable destruction and no signs of a ceasefire.
And you have tweeted about what you've described as a disregard for the concept of protection in Gaza. What did you mean by that?
The international humanitarian law, which all member states commit to, protection of civilian infrastructure, protection of civilians, protection of aid workers, and letting aid in. This is a commitment. This is a promise under which the entire humanitarian infrastructure works. This promise has been broken far too many times. What we meant is civilians are not being protected. Civilian infrastructure is being continuously destroyed. Aid has been obstructed many times deliberately. We have so much evidence about it. And talking of aid workers, This has been the highest number of aid workers ever killed. 2024 is said to be the deadliest year for humanitarians. We are bleeding 1,000 cuts.
OK, thank you for talking us through that. Deepmala Mahla from the NGO CARE.